For the COVID catastrophists who have peddled doom and gloom since the pandemic's inception, there has been an ongoing narrative to continue fostering fear. And now it's the masking of children and why they must be masked. But there's only one problem. New data now revealed shows why masks don't work and why those catastrophists are heading towards a humiliating path of public self-destruction. Join us to discuss the issue of mandating masks for children is our political correspondent, Anka Sahin. Welcome, Anka.
Hi, Michael. Nice to see you again.
Likewise. Now, the fear-mongering that's going on, is this about saving face or is this about a genuine attempt to warn us?
Well, if we go all the way back to the beginning of the pandemic, the messaging has been very uneven, inconsistent, and in some ways self-defeating right from the start. And so much of the information that was communicated to the public by the authorities, and when I say authorities, I mean not just the government, but also civil society, health professionals, and even the media. So information communicated to the public by all these different authorities. Some of that information has later been found to be quite misleading, really. The idea that lockdowns and extreme movement and travel restrictions could keep a respiratory airborne virus at bay was always misplaced. And it wasn't like this was a surprise to everyone in the world. There were certainly health professionals, epidemiologists, immunologists who said right from the start that approach was never going to work. But some of these people in positions of authority insisted that that's the path that we were going to take, particularly in Australia and New Zealand. And we lived for a period of time, we lived as if that artificial environment could last forever. And look, it obviously couldn't, and we are where we are now.
Now, the masking of children, which has been highly recommended, we've had our education sectors come out with the Catholic, the private and the public school education come out, but not the health minister, interestingly, saying that masks are recommended at school. But somehow that child for eight years and above, somehow that 8-year-old at school needs to wear a mask, but not in a crowd of 50,000 at the MCG. Is it this sort of confusing messaging and basically just ridiculous messaging that is at the root of people's unwillingness to even listen anymore?
It's certainly contributed a lot to it. When you get messaging like that coming out from the government and from the Department of Education and schools, saying that, right, we need to mask up the children because otherwise they're going to give COVID to each other and then they're going to go home and give COVID to their parents, while their parents are free to, as you said, go to a sports event with 50,000 people in a semi-enclosed environment, and there's no obligation to wear masks there. One would think, well, equally it could be the parents getting COVID from elsewhere and giving it to the children, and those children then giving it to other children. And just because they're wearing masks doesn't mean it's not going to go around as a virus of this sort tends to. Given that children are perhaps at the lowest risk of both getting COVID and showing symptoms if they get COVID, and also being seriously affected by it, I just cannot see the argument that starting with them is the way to go. And this is something that most people just can't get their heads around. And for the authorities to insist that it's going to be like this, just trust us and we know best, when they've been shown to be wrong with so many other things throughout this pandemic in the last 2.5 years. and asking people to take things on faith now, when we know that they were wrong about many things right from the start, it's just asking a little too much from the people.
Yeah. With the obvious mistakes that have been made, I don't think I've heard anyone in any position that has made these decisions come out and say, well, we thought this then, but now we know that we were wrong, or that we now know better, or it's just been, no, that's where we were and this is where we are. And again, as you said, trust us, take us on face value. This would have to be the worst case of messaging, health messaging and communications in the history of mankind, wouldn't it?
It would be close, if not right at the top. And if you look back, yes, I haven't really seen anyone in a position of authority come out and sort of admit that they were wrong with some of the things that they said and claimed and supported over the last 2.5 years. The narrative seems to be, well, that's how things were back then, and that was the information available to us back then, and things have obviously evolved, and this is where we are now. But I don't know if that, there seems to be an attempt to a certain extent to rewrite the history of what actually happened over the last 2.5 years, instead of taking responsibility and learning from mistakes, and to simply claim that some of that information was not available to us back when those decisions were being made, and some of them are as recent as 6 months ago, 8 months ago. We're not talking February 2020, we're not talking March 2020, when some of those initial decisions were being taken. And even back then, there were people with experience, health professionals, public health professionals, again, as I said, epidemiologists and immunologists, scientists with experience and expert knowledge, who were out there presenting alternatives and different points of view. And some of those people were sidelined, just so the narrative of extreme restrictions on lockdowns and movement restrictions, etc., could be pursued by those governments that decided that that was the only way to go.
We had the ridiculous situation here in Victoria, and in Australia, still going, where APRA has the ability to silence doctors who may have a different narrative or counterpoint. Whatever happened to the scientific method that welcomed robust debate?
It's extremely worrying. I mean, those when that letter that APRA sent around to doctors came out, and that was a while back now, I think almost a year ago, perhaps. I just couldn't believe it, and for doctors who are speaking out on condition of anonymity, saying that they have been threatened with potentially being deregistered if they go against the established position of APRA on how the health response to the pandemic should be handled. It's extremely worrying. I mean, at the end of the day, these are people who have relevant qualifications and the expertise. And let's not forget, they are also the people who are at the cold face of this, and who have been right out there dealing with people with COVID right from the start, not just when we started opening up, but even before. And shouldn't their views count for something? And if they as you would find in any scientific inquiry, if there are competing views, shouldn't they be given the opportunity to present based on facts and information and the scientific method, what they believe and why, so that we as lay people can try and understand where they're coming from and make up our own mind about what the options available to us are, as opposed to constantly being bombarded by a unilateral narrative.
Yeah, and we're reasonable as a citizenship not to expect our leaders to be medical experts, but we expect them to get good advice. And now we see the situation in Victoria where Dan Andrews said that everything was based on medical advice and medical experts, but also refuses to release that advice and goes one step further, actively fights spending money to stop that in VCAT, our money to stop us seeing what advice those decisions were based on. So how can we assume anything else? And it's not a conspiracy theorist that's been painted down. It's just, please show us what you made your advice decisions made on, and we can go from there to see, should this happen again, whether that advice is worth following in the next time. Because until we know exactly what happened and why, we're likely to end up in a similar situation at the next time.
Exactly. And if they really did follow that health advice that they said they did, and as we said, some of that advice could have been misplaced and incorrect because it could have been one-sided. But how are we to know unless that advice is released? And of course, under the regulations that they operated before, there was no obligation to release that advice to the public, and that is what the contention is at the moment. More recently, as we know, there was a recommendation from the Chief Health Officer with regard to masks that we have discussed, and one can of course debate whether or not that advice was well placed. But what we do know for a fact is that the government on that occasion, on this most recent occasion, chose not to follow that advice. So could there have been instances in the past where, again, certain advice was given, whether or not that advice was accurate, but the government decided to go down a different path? And I'm thinking, for instance, when during the 5th and 6th lockdowns, in particular in Victoria, when the playgrounds were closed, and people were questioning what advice that was based on. And then, and also in relation to the curfew that was in place for a certain period of time. And I remember the police commenting at the time and saying that it was a police matter and nothing to do with health. So you have to wonder where did that advice originate from, if it was in fact if it had in fact nothing to do with health, and was more of a measure to, I suppose, to keep the pressure on people, to tell them, look, we are in charge, and you need to follow our directions, whatever they may be. So here's the curfew, and you have to be back home by 8 p.m. Otherwise, there'll be consequences. And it sounds now, or the information that came out back then, that had nothing to do with health whatsoever.
It's ridiculous looking back now when you just say some of these things, and you couldn't imagine it. Playgrounds were closed. You weren't allowed to stop on your walk to sit down. You had to keep moving. You're allowed outside for 1 hour for exercise within 5 kilometres of your home. Sunsets were outlawed. You couldn't be outside at sunset. If you had a coffee cup, we were having police check to see if there was coffee in the coffee cup to justify you having your mask off. These things are just ridiculous. But the whole premise is, while we were speaking before, Anko, about the lockdowns, we need to do this to get our health systems in place to prepare for this. There was no actual preparation that went on. There was no getting the ducks in the row. There was just shut down, hide under the pillows, and let's hope it goes away.
Well, we were initially told, as you will remember, Michael, we were initially told that it was all about flattening the curve so that the pressure on the health system wouldn't be as bad as it was initially expected to be. And once that curve was flattened, suddenly the narrative changed to elimination and eradication, as if that sort of thing could be possible with a respiratory airborne virus. And that first, that first set of announcements about flattening the curve just went out the door. But the internet has a long memory. Those announcements and those statements are still there. They just conveniently got forgotten. And what seemed to have happened is, once in those initial days, once they could see that some of these extreme measures gave the appearance of eradicating the virus in the community, that quickly turned into an end in itself. And that became the pursuit that, the never-ending pursuit of, what they called in Victoria donut days, didn't they? I mean, it's enough to put you off donuts for the rest of your life. But so that became a pursuit in itself, rather than, those initial announcements about, well, we need to flatten the curve, so we need to take the pressure off the health system, and we need to expand capacity, perhaps build new hospitals, recruit more personnel, so that we are well prepared for it when it does get to a point where it starts stretching the health system. But nothing was done. So people lived, I mean, when I say the governments, state, territory and federal governments, they lived as if the day when the virus would be present in the community in great quantities would never arrive. And those initial announcements and promises of making the system more robust to meet the demand that would eventually come our way actually never came to pass.
Yeah, and we're now seeing the unintended consequences. For each day we were locked down, they were exacerbated. The mental health, the waiting lists, the untreated and undiagnosed other health conditions that have now worsened, that are going to take years to get through. And yet we're still at the same point. States like Western Australia that kept it zero, kept it locked down. Countries like New Zealand that went really harsh as well. They're all up where we are now. So all of that time that they exasperated the other conditions, the unintended consequences that worsened the economy, people unable to work and travel, people living in pain and discomfort from untreated, surgeries. For what?
That's right. And we will be living with and suffering from those unintended consequences for possibly years and even decades to come. And some of those, the impacts of some of those unintended consequences will perhaps not even be fully known until a significant amount of time has passed. And that's really sad. Of course, the damage to the economy is an obvious one. Borrowing money and getting into debt to keep the semblance of an economy when you've basically shut everything down for a period of time, and then expecting it to simply bounce back when you reopen, and then feigning surprise when you see that hasn't happened. It's just not very good governance. And really, we as the people have the right to expect much better from people who are in charge and who are playing with billions of dollars of our tax monies on a daily basis. And when it comes to mental health, I was extremely worried to see that the most recent census, whose results came out only a month ago, revealed that 1 in 5 Australians were reporting some type of a mental health condition. And it would be, I mean, I don't know, I haven't looked into past censuses whether similar questions were asked before, but to me, that's a massive percentage of the population that is reporting a mental health related condition. And to think that how bad that situation is, and to think that the lockdowns would have contributed to making it even worse than it is, that's the height of irresponsibility in terms of just basically turning a blind eye to the direct consequences of your actions when you decide to combat a pandemic in the way that you did.
And the flow-on effects from that mental health, as far as the effects on families and marriages and children, and just a less than functioning society, because we're all under that cloud. It's just a terrible thing. And I'm going to finish here with a quote. I can't remember who said it, but it goes to nature may have created the virus, but it's the governments that need to accept the blame for the pandemic. So Anchor Sehin, our political reporter, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure.